Ladies and gentlemen, why doesn't LeBron James or anyone that wants to end a specific issue, police brutality, and that is like a tiny, tiny percentage of law enforcement interactions. The vast majority of law enforcement interactions are like the video link I have in the description. There's a great YouTube segment called Police Activity, titled Police Activity. It's the YouTube channel. Subscribe to it. It is an amazing video of a police officer saving a baby's life. And it was a black woman, grandmother, who called the police because the baby was not breathing. And so choking on something. And the police officer came and thanked God. And he was like, a beautiful moment, saved her life. That's below in the description. Subscribe to Police Activity. Definitely hit subscribe to this channel right now because I want to give a rational viewpoint that isn't like, even though I have one distinct vantage point, I'm not so stuck in a tribalistic mentality that I can't say, okay, this, if I look at a certain instance, I judge it independent of, I try to judge it independent of my viewpoints, pertaining to my support for law enforcement. So I support law enforcement, passionately. They risk, men and women risk their lives every single day, defending, protecting society, cities, the United States of America. The same wonderful, morally superior liberal Democrats and athletes and musicians and activists who are trying to vilify and demonize all police would call 911, God forbid, if they needed help. Democrats, the ideology of the Democratic Party is smoke and mirrors, just focused on creating tension, elevating tension, a very deceptive narrative that all law enforcement are bad. It's not just one bad apple. Actually, it is. Like, Chauvin does not represent all law enforcement. And I've explained what I thought on that situation. So I believe Chauvin was guilty. But that doesn't mean that all law enforcement should be painted with the same brush. If you see, LeBron James, what he did was, and I've stated, President Trump shouldn't have gone after LeBron James. But again, what he did today broke the law, in addition to being counterproductive and not actually bettering society. He could have simply pushed for police reform or law enforcement reform pertaining to chokeholds or pertaining to restraining a citizen on a federal level. All you have to do to address the issue of police brutality is, on a federal level, make reforms go on a national scale. Democrats won't do that. Why? Because it's a very complicated, it's an issue that states have an input within, and Democrats actually don't want to tackle, just like they don't want to address Medicare for all. Like, they're not passing Medicare for all legislation. They're not passing Green New Deal legislation, yet the planet's going to end very soon. They're not passing Medicare for all legislation, yet people are losing their lives without single payer. They're not passing any legislation on a federal level, yet they want to demonize and vilify all police officers. Why doesn't LeBron James simply help draft a bill? What, instead of tweeting, "You're next," it's not going to solve anything. Emotions only go so far. The Democratic Party, in a way, media, okay, the $1 to $2 billion in property damage, 19 lives lost, the very peaceful protests did not make anything better for society. It didn't even address this issue. You could say, well, in Minneapolis or Minnesota, these reforms took place. They would have taken place anyway without any property damage. It's a liberal state. It's a Democratic-run state. Then the rebuttal is, well, in the civil rights movement, not everything was peaceful. And so, well, but there were leaders who were icons, American icons, like the most brilliant, like philosophical scholars of history and most courageous individuals who gave their lives. Is there an equivalent of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today? You tell me in the comment section, is there? Is there an equivalent of Malcolm X? Is there an equivalent of Medgar Evers? Is there an equivalent of the Freedom Riders? You tell me. I don't know if Colin Kaepernick is an equivalent. So, I don't think so. If you believe so, then tell me below in the comments section. But you can simply, all you need to do is address the issue on a federal level. It's not like, this is not rocket science. Democrats don't want to do that. They want to impeach Trump because he worked with Russia, or he incited and compelled January 6th, yet no court of law has ever gone after Trump. And now you have LeBron James, who broke a penal code 422 to 422.4. Any person who willfully, okay, so you can read, or by means of an electronic communication device, states something that could lead to a life lost in a very intimidating manner. You can read the legal statute. This is California law. He stated, and other states have this, so if it was Ohio or California where he tweeted that, he broke the law. They would have gone if you say, well, he didn't break the law because he did it up, they would have gone after any conservative athlete. They would have charged any conservative athlete with this. Because Congresswoman Maxine Waters said, get confrontational. Well, if it was Trump who motivated people and incited people with his words, did Democrats or did athletes incite $1 to $2 billion in property damage and 19 lives lost? How did that help anyone? That didn't lead to any legislation. There's no lawmaker that said, well, we signed this law or this legislation. If you want to point to like a police reform in Minneapolis, Minnesota, it would have happened without $500 million in property damage. It's a Democratic-run state. And if you say, well, Democrats needed that push, well, then that's a problem with the Democratic Party. Maybe people shouldn't vote for Democrats if they're so inept and incompetent. And there were two tragedies that took place in Minnesota. How on earth does Keith Ellison and how on earth does Amy Klobuchar get to say, oh, well, this isn't really justice? Like Keith Ellison the other day, the Attorney General, this is under his watch. Chauvin also had a history with an incident where Amy Klobuchar let him go. Okay, again, no questions pertaining to Amy Klobuchar's involvement or lack of input. No questions as to whether Keith Ellison had anything he could have done. It's a Democratic stronghold. Eric Garner in 2014 with President Obama, and this is how you know Democrats are pure hypocrites and disingenuous and duplicitous and engage in the most deceptive propaganda. Eric Garner lost his life, was murdered, I believe, in New York in 2014. I wrote an article about that in the Huffington Post. It's on hagoodman.com. Again, you can look at things case by case and say, okay, the vast majority of police interactions where somebody loses their lives, the police are justified. You can look at the tape. You can look at the videos. Go to police activity. You can look at the videos. The same people who are like, well, the police shouldn't have done this, shouldn't have that. If they were a police officer at that moment, they would probably act with less tact or compassion. People are hypocrites. And the same people who would say, oh, that's immoral and unjust, if they're put in the situation where their life's at risk, they'll do anything to go back home to their families, get back home to their families. We have an officer, Darian Jarrett, in New Mexico, who lost his life. Why isn't LeBron James tweeting about that? Does he not care? I understand if you want to focus on an issue that's affecting your community, God bless you, do so. But maybe you should focus on legislation instead of social media. Maybe you should actually push the Democratic Party to enact legislation, since you always fundraise and campaign for Democrats. So what LeBron James does, two sheriffs, by the way, were ambushed. There were people linking what LeBron James was talking about months back to the two sheriffs. Now he goes and he says the same thing and says, you're next, and puts the officer's face. He was responding to a young individual who was wielding a knife. What would LeBron James do if God forbid somebody was doing that to him? And there are people of color who work. There are black police officers, Latino police officers, Asian American police officers. So, like, you're painting everyone with the same brush. You have the same liberal pundits, some of whom, well, CNN and the $20 million venture capital people who have racial discrimination lawsuits, the biggest hypocrites on the planet. And they just foment this. And what LeBron James doesn't understand is that he's helping the Democratic Party get away with their culpability and their guilt. Democrats are composed of morally superior liberals who want to absolve themselves of historical or culpability pertaining to atrocities, whether historical or recent. That's all they want to do. Has nothing to do with helping any community. If you think that Democrats or that media care about a community that's facing that faces police brutality more so than any other community, but also needs the police more so than any other, needs police, law enforcement, hospitals, a structure, a societal structure, just like every other community, I should say. If you think that media and Democrats care, they don't. LeBron James cares. Yes, it's true, but he broke the law in targeting one police officer without knowing the facts. Why doesn't LeBron James simply say, even with a knife, the officer shouldn't have defended himself? That would be different. Why don't you draft legislations? Why doesn't AOC or anyone? Senator Cory Booker said the same thing as AOC. This is not justice. Okay, so draft legislation that says even if a person is wielding a knife, that the officer can't defend himself with lethal force. Draft legislation. Go ahead and do that. But you won't, because you're all hypocrites on the left, generally. Morally superior, yet morally inept hypocrites. Disingenuous and duplicitous. People who just want to feel that they're fighting for the next cause. Look, police brutality is an issue that needs to be addressed. The vast majority of police are good, honest, wonderful, beautiful human beings, courageous and noble. There's medical malpractice. If you want to, they try to say, oh, it's not bad apples. Oh, yes, it is. There are bad apples who are politicians also. Do you abolish Congress? You better believe. You want to go ahead and look at all the politicians and all the musicians and all the athletes that are implicated in immoral and illegal activity, and then compare them to all the police officers. It's not even a comparison. Look at all of Hollywood and look at all the police. You can look at all of Hollywood and see who's engaged in the most horrendous activity, or things that break the law, people that break the law all the time. So there's no comparison. Generally, law enforcement officials are good, honest people. Are there bad apples? Yeah. There are bad apples among liberal pundits also. There are bad apples among CNN journalists. There are bad apples among hospitals. There are bad apples everywhere. If you don't want to use the phrase bad apples, there are anomalies or incidents that take place in a country of 320 million Americans. Do those bad apples need to be addressed by the law if they break the law? Yes. You can't paint the people who would come and protect you as villains when you would call them in a moment's notice to help them to ask for their assistance. What would LeBron James or anyone do if, God forbid, somebody with a weapon, God forbid, went after them? God forbid. What would they do? They would call police. The same people who they vilify or they're many on the left are vilifying. LeBron James and others should simply push for legislation. If you don't want, what happened with, and I don't have all the facts, but I do understand there was a knife. If you're holding a knife, if you throw a firearm, it doesn't kind of matter what happens. The officer's going to want to protect himself because he or she has a family. You would too. Okay? If you were in the officer's position, a person throws a firearm or has a knife on them, you're not going to take a chance. That's just human nature, and it's what Democrats Democrats, again, should draft legislation. If they truly, this is the thing. I have a somewhat conservative viewpoint on this, although I do believe Chauvin is guilty, and I believe Eric Garner was murdered in 2014. But I'm a passionate supporter of law enforcement. But why don't Democrats and LeBron James push for legislation that says police officers can't use lethal force if a person is simply holding a knife or wielding a knife or throwing a firearm? Make the law on a federal, national scale, federal level. They'll never do it because Democrats don't want actual legislation. Just like they don't want a Green New Deal legislation, but they'll tell you that the planet's going to end. Just like they don't want legislation that would end a certain type of brutality, because that would end, they would have the same reaction to it as they did with the Chauvin trial. Well, you still should be angry. You still should be angry. And who benefits? Democrats, because we're angry with you, say the Democrats. Give me your thoughts below, as they do nothing. And as they did nothing in 2014. What LeBron James is doing is he is essentially assisting the Democratic Party in deceiving the entire country, especially the most important voting group. Give me your thoughts below. Hit